In looking at it from Beijing's perspective, the more that Trump threatens to undermine alliances, traditional allies like Mexico and Canada in the first instance, possibly Japan or South Korea, the more that plays into China's hands. China would like to see nothing more than Western alliances, whether they're economic, strategic, military, undermined, because they can only benefit from that.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report with me, Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Ian Williams, longtime foreign correspondent who has reported from Russia, China and Ukraine, and is the author of the book Vampire State: The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian, welcome.
Very good to be here.
Trump's tariffs on China have come into effect, but at a 15% lower rate than the US's immediate neighbours. In fact, just before we started, tariffs on Mexico appear to have been paused. Will China be breathing a sigh of relief?
It's hard to say, because looking at how Trump can easily change his mind, chop and change, tariff is his favourite word, don't forget. These are early days, so who knows where it can go. Yes, these tariffs imposed on China are pretty moderate compared with what he was threatening before the election when he was talking about 100%. But these are early days. Mexico now is suddenly exempt. Yes, Canada is still there, but who knows what turn it'll take next. And I would have thought that those wiser heads in Beijing will be cautious about breathing any sort of sigh of relief just yet.
And China's response was perhaps surprisingly muted, wasn't it? I mean, they've lodged a complaint with the World Trade Organization, but that's not really fully functional at the moment. Does China have the power to hit back at Trump?
Well, it's already hit back in imposing some controls on critical minerals, on lithium. It's already suggested that it's drawing up a list of targets of US companies. The problem is, of course, that China's on very weak ground in many senses, because there's never been a level playing field for foreign companies operating in China. Over the years, China has bent, broken, or circumvented just about every agreed upon rule of international trade. So they're not on particularly strong ground when it comes to the pushback from the United States. But certainly they do have weapons they can use. They can target US companies. They have done in the past. They have used restrictions on critical minerals where they control the entire supply chain. But the danger from their point of view is their arsenal is probably not as strong as that of the United States. So the chances are they will be the biggest loser in any all-out trade war.
And is a trade war between China and the US inevitable?
I think there will certainly be greater trade tensions, because China skepticism runs so deeply among those closest to Trump, with, of course, the exception of Elon Musk, who's heavily invested in his relationship with China. But that aside, I think there is so much China skepticism in this new administration, and so many voices that are urging a tougher line on China, because they see this as a result of decades of unfair practices by China, and not unreasonably. So I think that we will see a tougher line on China. How tough is hard to say so far. After all, Trump prides himself as saying he's a deal maker, so who knows? Perhaps this is some sort of negotiating ploy. But if you recall, during Trump 1, there was a trade agreement of sorts with China, which they never really followed through. The promises of buying more US goods simply didn't happen.
You've been writing in the Times about how China have actually been preparing to some extent for a possible trade war by moving a lot of their production abroad. Is that working?
It is, to a point. But there's a possibility you're going to create a whole game of tariff whack-a-mole. I spent some time in Vietnam when I was researching Vampire State, and there's a lot of Chinese investment has gone into Vietnam. Now, the government of Vietnam has a long history of animosity towards China. It runs very deep, and there's been some satisfaction in Hanoi that they've been on the receiving end of supply chains shifting away from China. They've benefited from this so-called de-risking. Now, the problem is the latest figures show that 30% of the the projects in Vietnam last year were from China, and China's become one of the biggest investors in Hanoi. Now, on the surface, you think, well, that's counterintuitive. That's a bit bizarre because it suggests Chinese companies are de-risking from their own economy, which in a sense they are, because they're concerned about geopolitics. They're concerned about having only one production base, i.e. China, their home base. But mostly they want to sidestep tariffs. Now, the danger for Vietnam and why confidence is a little bit premature is because they could quickly attract attention to themselves if a lot of this investment is merely rebadging stuff that's made in China as made in Vietnam, or as we're seeing in this big corridor, which is booming to the north of Hanoi, the border from the corridor from Hanoi to the Chinese border. Is that so many of the companies setting up there are sourcing their components, their raw materials from China. So Vietnam is kind of becoming an appendage to the Chinese supply chains. We're seeing a similar kind of thing in Thailand and Malaysia, where both governments are very savvy about the dangers. They don't want to get on the Trump radar, and they've both warned in December that they will be scrutinizing Chinese imports much more closely. So they will not just be transshipments. That may be easier said than done. Technically, it's difficult. Politically, it may be tough because these economies rely quite heavily on China, but they rely even more heavily on the United States. And so, Chinese companies have been very fleet-footed. They've been very tenacious in the way they have moved to try and avoid and sidestep the early tariffs, setting up production bases overseas, assembly plants, screwdriver assembly plants, warehouses where you'll change the label if you want. Solar panels being one example where the Americans have been particularly vigilant. 50% tariffs already on those coming from China, aggravated by the fact that much of the polysilicon raw material is sourced from Xinjiang, where there's been evidence of forced labor in the production process. So it's an incredibly complicated picture. And if you embark upon a policy which is built around tariffs, as Trump wants to do, it could quickly become very messy, very complicated, a game of whack-a-mole.
And how much is Vietnam at risk of being whack-a-mole, as it were? The previous administration were quite keen to get a bit closer to Vietnam, weren't they? Trump visited in 2019 as well. Does this risk that kind of closer relationship breaking up?
It does, but they'll have to weigh up the strategic against the economic, the benefits of getting closer to Vietnam for strategic purposes. Vietnam is an ally against Chinese bullying in the South China Sea. Arguably, Vietnam's the most formidable, the most muscular of the other nations in that area in terms of standing up to Chinese claims in the South China Sea. And we've seen America put in big efforts to get closer to the regime in Hanoi. When I was there was I think it was a Ronald Reagan, one of the aircraft carriers was coming through. Janet Yellen from the Treasury had visited. Biden was about to visit. They were putting a lot of effort into cozying up to Vietnam. Then balance that against Vietnam being used as a base for China to skip or sidestep tariffs, and it makes for a tough equation. Which way will Trump jump? It's hard to say. Unpredictability is his calling card.
Well, closer to home, as you say, with unpredictability, we've seen the tariffs put on Mexico and then now withdrawn again, pending some form of negotiation, presumably. Mexico and Canada have both had relatively friendly relationships with China in the past. Could this push the US's neighbours into closer relationships with, China, one of Trump's biggest rivals?
I think that would be a red rag to a bull. I think that would make things even worse. My instinct is that both will negotiate. I don't know what's happened in Mexico for Trump to decide that he won't impose tariffs after all. I would suspect something similar may be in the works in Canada, that this is performative to some extent. It is in order to be seen to gain concessions, whether those concessions are real or not. But I think one of the messages he will be sending, apart from the mercantilist America First message, is one of caution towards China. And we're seeing this with Marco Rubio's visit to Panama this weekend, which is clearly meant to send that precise message about, back off, be careful about China.
Well, on Panama, obviously, as you say, Rubio is heading over there. Trump has gone as far as to say that Chinese troops are in Panama controlling the Panama Canal. But how set is he on reducing the presence of Chinese companies in Panama? And will that worry Beijing?
I think so, because I think he sees Panama as a fairly easy one to bully. China's got a fairly big presence in South America. They've been cultivating, nurturing, pushing their relationships there for some time. Big new port opened in Peru towards the end of last year. China is working very hard on building its relationships in America's backyard. My best guess is that the Trump administration see Panama as a weak country, somebody they can bully, somebody through whom they can send a message to other countries in the area. Now, both ends of the Panama Canal sits a big port, which is controlled by a Hong Kong company, which is now, of course, a Chinese company. So to that extent, yes, there is a significant Chinese presence. Hutchinson, the company in mind, is a long-standing has a long-standing base in Hong Kong, so pre the handover. So it's a complicated picture, but he will have broader worries. Panama joined the Belt and Road Initiative, although reports from the weekend suggest that they're now saying that they are going to leave it. So the message is getting through. It's very Trump. You dial up the rhetoric. You talk about troops on the ground. Well, there will be private security, no doubt, at some of these facilities. But he will see the presence or the significant economic presence of Chinese companies as a threat. And he will see Panama making concessions as a way both of bringing them into line, but also sending a message elsewhere in South America, Latin America, but also seeing that Panama doesn't slip any further down the line of strengthening its relationship with China. It's pretty crude, but it could be effective.
And the Belt and Road obviously is crucial to China's international policy and plans. How much are they going to be willing to kind of step up and stand against America on bullying countries like Panama?
Well, arguably the BRI is a big instrument of bullying and coercion in many respects, but it's already in retreat and the shape of it is already changing. China's not got the money anymore. They got a lot of problems at home on the economic front. The funds available to banks under the BRI have been reduced quite drastically. It's reorientating itself towards what it calls the digital Silk Road, which is more about putting in technology, putting in the digital infrastructure into client countries. Now, arguably, although the monies are lower, that is potentially more dangerous because you are building a technological and data dependence upon China, which in some way is scarier than building a more straightforward trade dependence upon China. But nevertheless, the BRI is not what it used to be. It's already shape changing. It's already been reduced in terms of its value. So there's only so much that China can do. And in the past, we had this more straightforward competition between the investment coming from China, say, and the investment coming from the West, and arguably the West neglecting some of these key areas. And I think Trump's sort of introducing a little bit of political muscle into that, as well as sort of the traditional economic persuasion.
And you mentioned China's technical prowess in a way. DeepSeek came in last week. This is a Chinese cheaper sort of version of the AI models that Trump had been funding under his, or planning to fund under his Stargate initiative. How big of an advance is that for China?
I think it's not as big as a lot of people are making out. I mean, yes, it's spooked Wall Street. Yes, it spooked some of the big AI companies in the States because they have spent and they are spending a fortune to train these algorithms in order to try and get global leadership. But the closer you look at DeepSeek, the more concerning you become. And if you go through all the potential problems with it, from the nature of the training, it's now looking like it was basically trained on the more advanced American models, on the output from them, which technically goes against all the regulations in those models. So, theft is already being described as, which is not unusual, of course, for Chinese technology companies. Then you look at the privacy and the data protection issues, which are monumental in terms of the amount of data which is collected, which is harvested, which is enormous, even by the standards of apps. Italy has suspended the availability of this app in its country over data protection concerns and the unwillingness of the company to share information about what happens to the data. Ireland and Belgium are also looking closely at it. It's still available there, but they are going down the same line. Cybersecurity companies who have probed this app have discovered that its defenses, its cyber defenses, are very, very poor, and they've been able to get access to logs, to all sorts of other information on the app. That's before we even get to censorship. As soon as you start asking the thing about Tiananmen Square, about democracy, about Xinjiang, it's going to shut you down and say, let's change the subject, which is what it's been telling people that have been provoking it. And this goes to the heart of the problem in this competition with, it is serious competition for AI dominance between the US and China. But one of the difficulties that China is going to face is the Chinese Communist Party is deeply suspicious of anything with a mind of its own. So the conundrum they face is, how do you create an economically useful bot which is, by at the same time, keeping it politically compliant? Because if you train this thing on global data, it's going to be smart, but it's going to go off in terms, you're going to have to introduce censorship somewhere. So if you train it just on censored data, it's less economically useful because it's more stupid. So you've got this dilemma at the moment, and I'm not sure that China's yet completely worked that out, because the government regulations are very clear that any of these AI bots have to have socialist characteristics, whatever that means. But it does mean tight censorship. It does mean the ability to conduct draconian surveillance, disinformation. So it's very hard. Yes, there's a lot of effort and money, and arguably, in its own way, this chatbot is very innovative. Some people say that there are even stolen chips from NVIDIA, which is, of course, the main source of chips for the mainstream AI bots in the States, ChatGPT. And there's a suggestion that perhaps they've sourced these chips from somewhere where they should not have sourced them from. So there are all sorts of issues now. And I think you had this huge shock when it first came out. Look at this. Look at what China's achieved, a fraction of the price, and look how smart it is. But when you start peeling back the layers, there are some very familiar characteristics of the Chinese Communist Party that come out, and a lot of them not quite scary and not very pleasant.
Well, another area that Trump has been keen to challenge China on is the Arctic, and specifically Greenland. There's been a lot made of kind of Trump's being too bombastic over this, but he's not entirely wrong about Beijing's increasing presence in the Arctic Circle, is he?
Not at all. And in fact, Beijing has been pushing the envelope in Greenland itself. I looked quite closely at Greenland when I was writing an earlier book, Fire of the Dragon, which is looking more at geopolitics. And there have been some quite concerted efforts by China to get involved in critical mineral, rare earth mining in Greenland, which provoked the Danish government to push back. So it is a critical area. It is a very important area. And again, Trump's being bombastic, but he's sending a very clear message. And arguably it's getting through because just since he issued that threat, the Danish government has increased the amount of funding it's putting into to Greenland. It's increased its defense presence there. It's talking about bolstering the island in all sorts of ways. And there's no doubt that with the Arctic potentially opening up because of global warming, with the importance of the critical minerals, other natural resources that exist there, the area is coming into play in a way it wasn't before. And there's a far faster growing presence of both China and Russia, and the two in concert in that area. So again, it comes down to reading the tea leaves with Trump. Do you take him literally, or do you take the view that, he's rattling the cage, in which case it has had the desired effect in the short term by forcing Copenhagen to sit up and take notice and examine its own relationship and its own commitments and its own defense of Greenland, which, of course, it remains responsible for foreign affairs and defense of the island. And I think, and the Europeans are playing it reasonably cautiously because they don't really understand where Trump is coming from. So they're being, in their words and their deeds, they're not saying very much. They're seeing how it plays out, which, frankly, is probably the smartest thing you can do at the moment.
Well, Diane Francis was on this show last week and mentioned the mineral mining that China is big on at the moment. How far ahead are China in getting a hold of these mines and minerals than the US?
They're quite a way ahead. I mean, it's not just the critical minerals, the lithiums of the world, the rare earths, which actually are not very rare. It's just a name that's given to it by boffins, their properties. But the problem is that China controls every aspect of the supply chains, and that includes the processing of these things, which is phenomenally messy, dirty, energy intensive. The irony, of course, is that a lot of these things go towards the production of green technology, but the processing of them is dirty. And in China, it uses a lot of coal-powered energy, which is one of the ironies of the whole green technology output. But one of the issues I think that the Europeans and the Americans face, yes, they want to get back in the game when it comes to mining critical minerals, and both Europe and Britain and America have initiatives geared towards that. But when it comes to the processing, again, even where China doesn't mine the majority of a particular mineral, it still controls the processing. And this, as I say, it's difficult to understate the dirtiness of that process, the pollution, the amount of water that's used. And in a country like China, there is a far greater acceptance of environmental degradation because it's a dictatorship than there would be in the West. You simply couldn't do that in the West. So that you then ask yourselves, well, there's been much talk of developing cleaner means of processing these minerals, but cleaner processing inevitably is more expensive processing. So then are consumers, our companies, our governments willing to accept the higher costs of more control over these supply chains in order to move them away from China?
I mean, it's certainly will be a big concern in the future for America. But I just want to talk to you as well briefly about BRICS. Trump has issued threats to BRICS in recent weeks. That's the economic group in which China plays a quite leading role, over challenging the US dollar. The BRICS group is often painted by Trump as this sort of geostrategic alliance almost that he calls seemingly hostile, and he makes out it's set on challenging the US. But does Trump really understand what BRICS is? I mean, especially considering that he claimed that Spain was a member.
I don't think so. I mean, the BRICS is it's not a very cohesive group. Brazil, India, China, South Africa, Indonesia, I think, was joining, some of the Middle Eastern countries, UAE. They all
Russia,
have
of course.
Russia, of course, yeah, and they all have their distinctive interests. And yes, Russia and China would like to build a new strategic order, a new international order. They would like to see the end of the dollar. Others grumble about the dominance of the dollar, but then none of them would want to see the dominance of the dollar replaced by the dominance of the yuan, the renminbi, because then you're replacing one supposed imperialism with another, because China is, as imperialist a power as Russia is, indeed, as they allege America is. And so it's very difficult. There are lots of different interests in that group. South Africa, India, both democracies, Russia, China have distinct interests in undermining the existing world order. The others perhaps less so. But these sort of subtleties and niceties have never really been in the Trump repertoire. And so, as far as he's concerned, anybody that talks about threatening the dollar is fair game to threaten back. But I've always been quite skeptical about the ability of the BRICS to really come to any meaningful agreement, because I think that rhetorically there'll always be a document to be signed about US dominance, and China and Russia will play on the historic supposed crimes of imperialism and colonialism. But they are both, in their own way today, two of the world's biggest imperialist and colonial powers in the way they are behaving, and that won't be lost on other members of BRICS. So I'm a little skeptical about the ability of them to actually work together in a meaningful way. And I dare say there are those around Trump cautioning him that it isn't quite as simple as that.
So should Trump be worried about an increasing closeness between China and Russia?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think that is one of the defining challenges of his presidency, and indeed going forward over coming years, the alliance between China and Russia, because it is tightening. The Ukraine war, I don't believe, could be sustained in the way it is without support from China. They are effectively underwriting the Ukraine war. Without Chinese support, Russia simply couldn't maintain the war in the manner that it is at the moment. I see Xi and Putin as having very similar worldviews, whether it's Putin's Ruski Mir, the restoration of the Russian world, the Russian-speaking world, Xi's China dream, the rejuvenation of China. Many, though, of those close to him regarding the old borders of the Qing dynasty being the rightful borders for them to aspire once again to. Of course, the slight problem with that, of course, is the Qing dynasty included a large chunk of what is modern-day Russia, including large amounts of land to the north of the Amur River, the Far East, modern-day Vladivostok. So you have the clash of two imperial visions. I don't know quite how they would sort that one out. But clearly, you've got two powers bent on restoring national greatness, on undermining the current international order, and what happens in Ukraine, and of course, this is something which we have yet to see coming out of the new Trump presidency, could play a big role in China's decision-making over what to do about Taiwan. If Beijing senses Western weakness around Ukraine, lack of resolve in supporting Ukraine, then it might encourage Xi to step up the pressure on Taiwan, if not invade Taiwan. And clearly within Taiwan, there's concern at the ramifications of a weakening of Western support for Ukraine, as indeed there is concern in Taiwan, in Taipei, about threats against Panama and Greenland, because if borders are questioned, it plays into the hands of those in China who would all too readily, or do all too readily, question the borders of Taiwan and other regions that China claims.
And how do you think some of China's neighbors will be feeling about the beginning of the Trump presidency? Japan, Taiwan, you've mentioned, other South China Sea nations. Is a more sort of openly China hostile America good news for their sort of plight against China's growing Pacific ambitions?
I think there are different ways of looking at it, because clearly a more robust American government towards China would be welcomed, I would have thought, in Japan, perhaps in South Korea, but also a more tariff-minded administration would not be quite so welcome. And indeed, in looking at it from Beijing's perspective, the more that Trump threatens to undermine alliances, traditional allies like Mexico, and Canada in the first instance, possibly Japan or South Korea, the more that plays into China's hands. China would like to see nothing more than Western alliances, whether they're economic, strategic, military, undermined, because they can only benefit from that.
And just to finish then, Ian, do you think that China see Trump as a bigger challenge to their world plans than the previous Biden administration?
I think Biden was probably more predictable, and in that respect, I often wondered before the election which way China would jump, which candidate it wanted to go for. And to me, it spoke volumes that when we had details of a hacking campaign that China conducted before the election, it was an equal opportunity hacking campaign, and it looked like they'd hacked people from both the Republicans and the Democrats, which suggested that maybe they didn't have a favorite. But I think that they will be unnerved. Beijing likes predictability, whether that is a good thing, good predictability or bad predictability. If they get a better handle on what's going on, they will be unnerved by a lack of predictability, by uncertainty. And I think that those close to Trump have always argued that one of his great assets as a diplomat, and I say this very cautiously, is that he is unpredictable. Some would say what's that got to do with diplomacy? But his unpredictability has always been, if not quite the madman theory, but his unpredictability in terms of what he will or won't do, how he'll do it, what he might say next, is something which is much more difficult for another government to factor in, whether that's a friendly government across the border in Mexico or a more hostile government in Beijing. And I imagine part of the policy at the moment, part of the aim is to keep them on their toes, is to wrong foot them, is to leave them wondering what he's going to do next.
Ian Williams, thank you very much for joining me today.
A pleasure.